Anyway, we're just so glad to have you here, and Mark is doing the final touches on his special presentation, because we're just so glad to have him as a member and just the historian that he is. And Mark, you let him know, because I'm keeping.
Well, I'm still trying to open my program.
Well, did I tell you where I fixed? Yes, please do. My grandmother had peanuts, my family did. And they were pulling out of, they come out the morning. And so they pulled the vines up along the beach nut tree, under the trees. And then I would have to pull those things off, dirt and all. Yes, dirt and all. So they were dirty. So you had to pull that off and then you get. So that's how they really started. Okay, and to get to the point that they've gone through a lot. I think somebody else out here has a story, Mark. I thought that somebody was raising their hand that they might have had a story. I bet if we would switch subjects a little bit to another crop that we have here, and we still do have, that big green leaf. Well, it got a sticky and has those little worms on it and all that other stuff that you put down there. I never did any of that, but I had enough people tell me about it that I felt like I had been through it. But it sounds like you got a lot of stories.
You know, I have to get them all.
That Mark,
Well, I'm still waiting for it to open. I might just go ahead and, we might have to do it without visuals today.
Well, I think some of these folks know you well, and they know you can do it with or without. But before I do turn it over to him, I would ask you to make sure that you do sign our book. It was there in the door, many if you did sign in, but please do that, because that helps us with all kinds of funding to help us with our nonprofit status. And so we appreciate that. And this is one of several things coming up, and I'm sure Mark will tell you some more about that. That's enough for me. I'll just go out here and rest a little bit.
Well, I want to thank y'all all for coming out.
Sit over here. Here's the seat. Okay. Oh, the train.
Judy, be careful with that. I probably would sit on that chair.
That's the engineer's seat.
Yeah, it's not stable.
We'll
find another chair.
We'll find another chair.
Listen, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I had planned to have a visual aid with this. I thought I came in half an hour early and had plenty of time to get it up and going. And of course, technology will always betray you in the end. What I want to talk about a little bit today, this is the first of a 4-part series I'm doing on the history of Granville County. And we thought that in connection with the Crossroads exhibit, that this would be a good time to maybe stop and reflect. And I try to do something like this about every 2 or 3 years. And I thought this would be a good time we could spend and we could maybe review some of the history of Granville County. I know some of you are familiar with it, some of you are not so familiar with it. How many of you have been in Granville County for more than 20 years? How many of you's ancestors have been here? All right, now I thought there would be a few of those. 300 years. I'm working on about 275 in my family. And when I say Granville County, I'm talking about what I call old Granville County. Granville County was originally formed in 1746. As you may know, it was formed out of, it was part of the Granville District. Now, how many of you heard of the Granville District? All right, this is Lord Granville. Lord Granville was a man named John Carteret. Now, John Carteret was his name. His actual title was Lord Granville. Originally, Earl Granville, later on, Lord Granville. And he owned, basically, he inherited the northern half of what is now North Carolina. He was one of 8 lords proprietors. The proprietors got their land as a reward for helping Charles II overthrow Oliver Cromwell in the English Revolution and reestablish the monarchy, which, interestingly enough, we now have Charles III. And the Latin word for Charles is Carlos, or Carlos, and consequently, that's why North Carolina. The name North Carolina is a Latin version of Charles, the land of Carlos, Carolina, and of course, North Carolina. So this section was owned by a man named John Carteret, Lord Granville. He inherited the land. He never set foot in North America. He was the ultimate absentee landowner. Basically, what he did was he went into real estate business. He assigned a man named Henry McCullough to come here and several other agents, and they came here. They opened up land offices, and by the early 1700s, the area around Tidewater, Virginia, Chesapeake area, and all that area had gotten actually very crowded. People had been there for almost 100 years, starting in 1608, 1609. The area had gotten very crowded. People were looking for better land. They were looking for more opportunities. I will say this, the kind of people who came to Virginia were the kind of people who were motivated to go across an ocean, leave their families that they would never see again, and would come here and start a new life in a new world. They had that spirit about them. And one of the things that you'll see when we talk about Granville County history is how their descendants had that same restlessness, that same desire to see what was on the other horizon, to move to a new place. Keep in mind, like I always mention this to people, when people say, you know, our ancestors left Virginia and came to North Carolina, or they left North Carolina in the 1840s and went out to Tennessee, when you left, that meant you didn't see your family again. You might see them once or twice again for the rest of your life. It wasn't the travel that we have today, of course. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the area that becomes Granville County from a geological point of view. Now, this does have some bearing about the development of this area. And there is basically a fault that runs from Raleigh roughly up and follows US 1. It runs up through Henderson. And actually, you can see little bits of it along the way. Are y'all familiar with, you'll see it like if you're familiar with the Tar River, and I wish my visuals were working today, because Tar River is the line between Franklin County and Vance County. And there's a little hook that you can actually see about where Egypt Mountain. Have any of you ever heard of Egypt Mountain? Okay, well, it's not really a mountain, but for around here, it's a mountain. And this is part of a Triassic, which is about 300 million years ago. This is a fault. The fault has not been active in millions and millions of years, so you don't have to worry about an earthquake or anything like that. Though we have had some, or closer, we had one in Lunenburg, Loudoun County here about 10 years ago, and of course, the worst one that ever happened in Granville County was the results of the Charleston earthquake in 1886. And it actually caused some damage here in Oxford. Why is this significant? Well, for one thing, what you have to realize is the area that we're at now actually used to be part of Africa, the continent of Africa. And that over time, this pulled away with the continental plates, the Atlantic Ocean was formed. And so there was a lot of geological activity along this area. And it manifests itself today. Think about things like Tungsten Mine, Greystone Quarry, Sunrock Quarry, down below Kittrell, the quarry that's located in the Butler Creedmoor community, the mining that has been significant in the history of this area. So it does play a difference. Another thing is, there's kind of what I would almost call a mini continental divide that runs through Old Granville County. And let me clarify, when I say Old Granville County, what am I talking about? Present-day Warren County, present-day Franklin County, present-day Granville County, and Vance County. Just to give you a working frame here, Granville County was formed in 1746. In 1763, Granville County was divided in half. Granville County and what was known as Butte County Butte County was a short-lived county. It only existed in 1779, and it was further divided into Franklin County and Warren County. And then later on in 1881, Vance County was formed from parts of Warren, Franklin, and Granville. Had an interesting conversation a couple of years ago with a lady that called me, and she was very confused. She was doing her research on her ancestors in this area. She said they moved around a lot. I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, first they were in Granville County, then they moved to Butte County, and then they moved to Warren County, and then they moved to Vance County. I said, no. They stayed in the same place. It was the county lines that kept going. Incidentally, Butte County was named for a man named John Stuart, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1760s, and was especially known for being the mentor and tutor of one George III. And he had a county briefly named for him, Lord Butte. And of course, when the Revolution came around, it would not do to have a county named for George III's mentor and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So the county was divided, and by that point, the area had grown so much, it was divided into Franklin County and Warren County. Franklin County being named for Benjamin Franklin, Warren County being named for a man named Joseph Warren, who was an early leader in Massachusetts during the American Revolution, and he gave his life at the Battle of Bunker Hill. If he had not died at Bunker Hill, he would have been one of the founding fathers in the same of, say, John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. But he died at the battle. Interesting enough, he was already a colonel, and he didn't feel that his military experience was sufficient, so he joined us at private. Going back to what I was talking about with geography, this plays into the development of agriculture in this area. And one of the things with the Crossroads exhibit that they'll talk about, particularly focus on, is this transition from an agrarian society to a suburban society to even more of an urban society. And we do have some farmers here today, do we not? There are still people involved in agriculture. Agriculture is still important. It is not as all-encompassing as it was in the 1970s and before. Now, because of the soils in this area, if you drew this line that I'm talking about, this ridgeway, as it were, and you'll note there's a little town in Warren County called Ridgeway. This ridgeway, and if my technology hadn't failed me so badly, you would see there's almost a mini continental divide here. This line where US 1, it comes on up to Henderson, it follows the railroad, picks up on Interstate 85 and turns and goes up into Virginia. All the creeks on the eastern side of this ridge run into the Tar River. All the ones north of this run into the Roanoke River. It's interesting, there's even a plantation house in Vance County called Roanoke. And there's a spring on the back of the house, and that spring runs into a creek that runs into, eventually makes it into the Roanoke River, and the spring in the front of the house goes into the Tar River. And incidentally, I thought this was really interesting. What is you've heard of the Algonquins. What is the Algonquin word for shell money? Shell money, because Native Americans use shells as a medium of exchange. Roanoke. That's where the word Roanoke comes from. And one other one that I thought was really interesting. What is the Algonquin word for mask? Anybody want to take a guess? Raccoon. I thought was kind of interesting. But I digress. Y'all know me. It's people that see me before know I'm really bad about getting off topic. So I'll get back to the subject at hand eventually. Geography plays a role in the sense of this. Most of the land that's east of this ridgeway or east of US 1, Henderson, and that area is well suited to grow in tobacco. The land to the east is better suited toward growing cotton. Now, it's not a fast and furious rule that if you live in Virginia, you can't grow cotton, but if you live down in Littleton over in Warren County, you can't grow tobacco. It's going to demolish that pattern. And this has some significance, particularly with the development of Henderson later on. Now, that's kind of the basics of where we are and how our geography is. Now, people ask me all the time, they say, Mark, what is your favorite part of local history? What's your favorite time period? And my standard answer is, my favorite time period starts at about 12,000 BC and goes up to 2022. I love all of it. Of course, I'm like most people, there are certain things that I am interested in. The war between the states, the American Revolution, a lot of our history during the Second World War and Great Depression. So I thought I would add a little context today by starting out. We are talking about the history of Granville County, but don't forget, there has been a human presence here. Even though Granville County was formed in 1746, there's been a human presence here going back to about 12,000 BC, or about 14,000 years ago. And there's strong evidence that there's been a human presence here even further back than that. There's a site called Cactus Hill in Surrey County, Virginia, which is not that far away, and they have found evidence of a human habitation going back to 40,000 BC. And I always get this question, so I'll go ahead and answer it the best as I can. How do we know how old these things are? And some artifacts I want to talk to you today that date back to about 12,000 BC or 4,000 BC. How do we know this? A lot of it's determined by a method called carbon-14 dating. Have you ever heard that term? All living things have carbon-14, and we have it in ours. When we expire, the amount of carbon-14 starts to decay. So you can use it as a grade. I'm going to explain it. Probably it's much more complicated than this, but the way I understand it, I'll do it as easy as I can. Over time, the level of carbon-14 deteriorates. So if you can determine, say, that you have an artifact and it's, say, it has 80% of the carbon-14, and it's 5,000 years old, and then you have another one and you can determine that it has a 60% carbon-14 date, and it's 10,000 years old, then you can start to extrapolate and gradually determine how old something is. Now, some of the artifacts I have here today, I just want to show you. I've got about 4,000 artifacts that I've collected over the years. I will be honest with you, totally honest with you. I started collecting when I was about 8 years old. I grew up on Carl Lake. I did not know when I was younger that that was the property of the United States federal government. I will say that I will consider it my civic duty, knowing that the United States government has many responsibilities, that being the public taken it upon myself to be the guardian of these artifacts that are on my office. Seriously, the stuff I collected over the years. I'm particularly proud of this, and this can be found in this area. This is called a redstone, which is a Clovis point. It's about 12,000 BC. It doesn't look like much. I found this when I was young, when I was about 12 years old, which is akin in the world of artifacts and prehistory. It's one of the goals we have. It's like hitting a hole in one in golf. You play golf your whole life and never get a hole in one. But I did find a fluted point. It would look a lot nicer than this. My somewhat not so bright cousin, when we were about 12 years old, got the bright idea that he wanted to make a bow and arrow out of it. So he took it and he got a stick and all the rest of it. And of course, it hit a brick wall and knocked the point off of this part off of it. But this is very significant. I'm very proud of the fact that the folks at East Carolina came and actually documented this. This is important because it has a fluted point on it, which means it fits on the arrowhead, the arrow like this. What they would be hunting with this are things that we don't see anymore. Woolly mammoths, not saber-toothed tigers, but elk or things like this. This is part of this area from about 12,000 BC to 7,500 BC. Was known as the Paleo-Indian period. And some basic things that you'll find are hunting caribou, elk, deer, of course, bear. This is unusual because later on, you almost never see bear skeletons or remains of bears in any kind of settlement or human camping or anything like that. It's believed that bears were considered sacred. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that they were really big and ferocious. And it was a lot easier to kill a deer than an elk or a bear. This time period is featured with fluted spear points, knives, scrapers made from stone, working hides, baskets might have been used, but they would have been made out of straw. People moved. They were mobile, okay? The next time period that comes along from about 7,500 BC to about 1,000 BC, or roughly 3,000 years ago, is the Archaic period. Settlements range from small hunting camps to large bases or camps. There were stone quarries. Campsites are usually occupied over a generational time period. And rather than having small families or bands, you start to see larger communities. From about 1000 BC to 1750 AD, or about the time that Granville County is formed, this is known as the Woodland period. This is where you see things like bow and arrows, the introduction of pottery vessels for cooking and storage, and more of an agricultural or settled environment. Hunting becomes supplementary to settled communities. And I'll show you some things I found over the years. This is, that's a nice point right there. And let me say this, we call these arrowheads, but most of them are not arrowheads, they're spear points. They're throwing spears. Attle weights is the actual term for it, which is a thing almost like it has a weight on it with a stick and you throw it like this. Bow and arrows come in later on, much later on, like from about 1000 BC up until 1750s. This is because they're hunting smaller game, rabbits, deer, raccoons, things like that. This is a nice savanna point. That's a nice sandy point. And if you, before you leave, if you want to come over here and take a look at these, I'll be glad to show them to you. I mentioned clay-fired pottery. Clay-fired pottery is a sign of settlement and agriculture. Almost all of these, now let me show you this. You see the curvature on that? That bowl was huge. You see how long that bowl would have been? I've got about 2,000 pieces that I found in one spot. And if I live to be 300, I might be able to put it all back together. Make a little progress. Good progress is maybe fitting 2 or 3 pieces together over the course of a year. Again, note the curvature on this. This gives you some idea of the size of the pottery. Incidentally, and if you want to, just be careful if you want, I can pass this around. This is clay. This is good old fire Granville County clay, an orange clay we see everywhere. And if you'll notice, you can see the indentations where they use their fingerprints. And I always am intrigued because I've actually got one of these, if you get a magnifying glass and look at it, you can see the individual fingerprints, which we don't know who they are, but it does certainly add a level of individuality and realness to it. So just, I'm gonna pass that around and you just want to take it, be careful with it, and just pass it along. Now, this area originally was settled by the time of European contact, was settled by a Siouan Indian group known as the Saponis. Now, they were associated more with northern tribes. The ones south of them, the Tuscarora and some of the other groups, were the Mississippian civilization that was associated more with mound building, like Town Creek and places like that. There was kind of a no man's land in between the two groups. It would be a line that would run through like Wake County, Johnston County, like that. In the 1710s, particularly 1712, 1713, the Tuscarora War between eastern North Carolinians that has European settlers. It was a large war. The Tuscarora's were defeated. They left and went to New York. This opened up this area in the 1720s and 30s. As I mentioned before, Lord Granville is selling property here. Get 640 acres, which is a square mile of land, for the equivalent of 2.5 pounds Virginia money in 1740. That only extrapolates out to about $50 an acre today. And you also got what was called head rights, which meant every person you brought here, if you brought your mother-in-law or your slaves or your friends or your co-workers and brought them here, they got 640 acres of land granted to them. They were doing everything they could to encourage people to move here. Now, the first known explorer in this area was a man named John Lederer in 1760s. He came through what would later become Granville County. In 1728, Colonel William Byrd and his party passed through the area because they were establishing the border between Virginia and North Carolina. It's interesting because in Byrd's diary, he notes that there was a creek he came across that had a preponderance of hazelnut trees, and he said that he would call this area Nutbush. And that's where Nutbush Creek comes from. It dates back to 1728, and it has some significance later on, which I'll talk about in another program that we'll do. I'm going to give this one more shot, and then I'm going to throw it in the trash can. In the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, most people that came to this area, the vast majority were from Virginia and the Tidewater area. Certain families, names that you know, came from certain areas. The Taylors and the Hawkins family came from Caroline County. From Surrey County came the Hargroves and the Paces. They came from Surrey. However, my folks went to Johnston County. I'll just say this: my mother's a Steinbach, and I attended with the Askews and the Woodliffs, and they haven't been here that long. They didn't get here until about 1750, 1760. And then you had families like the Bullocks and the Henderson that came from Hanover County. All this is the Eatons, the Harrisons, Hendersons, Hargroves, Bullocks, Taylors, Williams. These are names that you know, that you've done genealogy work, you're familiar with. These people came here first, they got the best land, and then they went into real estate business. You had a man like Thomas Person. I'm going to talk a little bit about Thomas Person. His parents came here in the 1740s. He grew up here. He was a surveyor for Lord Granville. Eventually, he became the largest landowner and largest slave owner in Granville County. He actually owned about 82,000 acres. Now, to give you an idea how much land that would be the equivalent of, say, Stovall Township. A lot of land. He owned about 90 slaves. And he went into the real estate business. It was a simple case of who got here first. Now, what I find particularly interesting about Granville County is by 1746, there were about 2,000 people living here, and most all of them were Virginia residents. Just 5 years later, in 1754, there were 32. It went from 1,200 people moved here in that short time period. What's interesting about it, enslaved people made up about 25% of the population. As time moves on, those numbers will change. Slavery really was established here early, and it got established here in a big way. This area along the line, along the border with Virginia, Granville County, what's now Vance County, Warren County, Halifax County, was a little bit atypical of the rest of North Carolina. North Carolina, by and large, particularly in the Piedmont area and the mountains, had small farmers. There were small subsistence farmers. In this area, you had crops like cotton and tobacco. So there was an apparatus, there was a major cash crop there, and there was, as a consequence, slavery developed here. By 1790, about 45% of the population here was enslaved. By 1860, over half of the population was enslaved. We're getting way ahead of ourselves here, but just to demonstrate to you how important slavery was to the economy in this area, in 1860, the total value, tax value of enslaved people in Granville County was about $6 million, which if you extrapolate that into, it's about $126 million in today's money. That is twice of the value of the real estate in Granville County. And stop and think about that for a second. If you own land, you took all the land and the value of all the land in Granville County, you would have to double it to equal the amount of value of enslaved people. So that's the thing that you need to keep in mind.
Mark,
Yeah.
Thomas Person was the biggest landowner in 2000. Where did he live? Where was his?
All over the place. He actually owns some land in Tennessee. Several places, and I'll talk a little. It's a good time to talk about Thomas Person because I have an affinity for Thomas Person. He's probably the most important person from this area in the 1700s. He lived at a place called Goshen, which is over near a satellite community, which might be almost over in the Person County line. He also owned a lot of property in the area of Littleton. As a matter of fact, he has one of his buildings that he owns is still standing. It's an ordinary or a tavern. Pardon me for the bad pun, but it's the only time you'll hear the word ordinary ever associated with him. Because in every other way, he was extraordinary.
Was it Goshen Plantation?
Goshen Plantation was his plantation. Now, you don't hear a lot about Thomas Person for a couple of reasons. He never had children, he married, but never had children. There was no known portrait of him. He was not a self-promoter. He preferred to work behind the scenes. There's, like I said, he didn't leave any descendants. His home is long gone and burned in the 1930s. So there's not anything tangible about him here. I always likened him, though, he was one of the wealthy people. And he was in a lot of ways, I've heard somebody use the phrase about Franklin Roosevelt that he was a traitor to his class. Well, in a lot of ways, Thomas Person was, because even though he was the wealthiest person and he was of the elite, he was a great believer in individual rights. And one of the problems with Granville County in the 1700s and North Carolina in general was that it was not a democracy. Okay? Let me give you an example. 1790, okay? How many of you can vote? Okay, keep your hands up, okay? All right, if you're female, take your hand down. You couldn't vote at 1790, okay? Anybody still got their hand up? Okay, hand up. Are you property owners? If you're not a property owner, take your hand down, okay? All right, so we still got, how many hands we got up? 4? All right, do you own more than 50 acres of land? If you own more than 50 acres of land, keep your hand up, okay? All right, so all the people in this room, there's how many hands we got up? 3? You can vote. But only in this sense. The candidates are determined in a less than democratic way. Let me give you a for instance. In Granville County in the 1760s, if you wanted to run for sheriff, you had to be nominated by the people who represented you in the colonial assembly, what today would be the state house, the state House of Representatives or state house or the state senate, right? Those people got to pick who would run for sheriff. Now, anybody want to take a guess at who appointed the candidates for the state legislature or the colonial assembly at the time? The sheriffs. Okay? It was a very corrupt system. It was what was called, and this happened in a lot of counties in North Carolina in the 1760s and 1770s and 80s. It's called the courthouse county. All right, let me give you a for instance. Samuel Benton. Now, you've probably heard of Samuel Benton. Samuel Benton owned a large plantation on a big hill called Oxford Plantation. That was the name of the plantation. And he thought, gosh, it'd be really nifty if I got the courthouse moved to my property. So he very generously donated to Granville County a couple of acres for the new location of the courthouse, which is right over there, okay? And what did Samuel Benton do? Well, he opened up a livery stable, he opened up a tavern, he opened up a store, he went in the real estate business, and he was the sheriff of Granville County. He was a representative in the colonial assembly. He was the clerk of court. He was the registrar. He was the colonel of the local militia. And just for good measure, and most important of all, he was one of the 3 chief justices of the peace. The clerk, the head of the court. All transactions in Granville County, on up until 1868 and throughout North Carolina, the most powerful group of people were the justices of the peace. Any business, if you owed money, if you wanted to apply for, open up a tavern, you paid your taxes, you came and went to the local court. And the court was corrupt. Matter of fact, to the point where average people got so upset about the situation and felt it was so unfair, there was a movement called the regulator movement. Have any of you familiar with the regulator? You might have heard of it. It's particularly in North Carolina, it was particular to Granville County and Orange County. And it got to the point where average people were so upset about the unfair taxation, the undemocratic nature of things, the crookedness of things, they rose up. And they rose up to armed conflict. They might take Judge Williams or Judge Henderson, and they might take him and tar and feather him, or they might take him out of the courthouse and take him down to the Eno River and throw him in the river. Quite disorderly. Governor Tryon, British governor of North Carolina, had enough of it. He put the call out to raise a militia to march from the coast to Piedmont, North Carolina, to put down this rebellion. And matters all came to a head at the Battle of Alamance in 1771, in which the Regulators were defeated. The Regulators lost the battle, but in a sense they won the war, because this is where the basic idea of a fair and better government in North Carolina people started moving in that direction, so that a mere 5 or 6 years later, when the revolution comes around, no taxation without representation, a lot of the people that supported Governor Tryon are now anti-British. People like the Hawkins family, the Caswells, the Martins, William R. Davies, some of the people that have been the biggest supporters of the British Crown have seen the error of their ways, so to speak. But one person who was always sticking out the little guy was Thomas Person. Good example, Thomas Person, in colonial times in North Carolina, it was the official church was the Anglican church. It didn't matter whether you were Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, everybody paid a tax. They paid a vestry tax, which paid the salary of the Anglican local Anglican minister, and also paid for the vestry or the building of the Anglican church. And incidentally, in Williamsboro, North Carolina, which used to be part of Granville County in 1772, the second oldest standing church in the state of North Carolina, still stands to this day in Williamsboro. Each and every year, Thomas Person for 30 years introduced a measure into the Colonial Assembly, saying, wait a minute, this is unfair, let's get rid of the vestry tax. Every year he failed, and every year he, without fail, reintroduced that measure. Didn't care the laws he was trying to make. And it'd be good if we talked a little bit now about Williamsboro. I know a lot of you, you're familiar with Williamsboro, right? Williamsboro at the time, it was formed about, it first shows up in the records in early 1760s. It was the most important town or community in old Granville County. It's really interesting, there's a description of it when some of Washington's troops were coming from Yorktown, coming through on their way back to South Carolina to reinforce General Greene during the Revolution. There's an actual account here, November 8, 1781. The morning at sunrise, the troops took up the line of march, passed through a fine and lovely country known as Granville. Roads were very sloppy. We made several miles into North Carolina and camped near Williamsboro. The town is a fine place, composed of one fine church, one tavern, one smith shop, and 5 or 6 small log houses. Granville is a lovely place. Now, if you go to Williamsboro today, it's kind of interesting because what would you find? One church, one Dollar General, and about 5 or 6 houses. And a storage facility. And the storage facility, where there used to be an old town. I bring this up because, I mean, it's hard now to imagine in that time period, considering this was merely a wilderness, that was considered a large place. And don't forget that Williamsboro, as many of you heard, was so important. Remember, Oxford was not even incorporated to 1816. Henderson didn't come into incorporation until 1841. Williamsboro was considered a very important place in its day. Several important people were from there. Richard Henderson was from there. Leonard Henderson, John Williams. John Williams signed the Articles of Confederation. Williamsboro is named for him. One of his descendants, incidentally, is a man named Thomas Lanier Williams, but you might know him a little better by his pen name, Tennessee. It's in Tennessee Williams. Tennessee Williams' ancestors were from here. And incidentally, as I go through and do these programs, being as I'm genealogist, one of the things I like to talk about is how many people throughout this country have ties that come back to Granville County. I'll give you one just this week. You all familiar with a baseball player named Gaylord Perry?
Yes.
A Hall of Fame baseball player, right? Just passed away last week, famous for his spitball. And I got an interest in myself, Perry. And I looked it up, and his father was from Martin County, and he was born in Martin County. His grandfather was from Martin County. His great-grandfather was from Martin County. And his great-great-grandfather was a man named Redding Perry, who was buried at Cassian Plantation in Franklin County. How many of y'all have ever heard of the Perrys in Franklin County? Okay, you know the Perrys in Franklin County, which used to be part of Granville County. And I just use that as a small example of somebody who has ties to this area. My favorite one, I'll go ahead and mention it, there's two that actually have relevance for the exhibit out there. One of them is a man named Thomas Hart Benton. There's a painting out there of a little small painting that was done. Thomas Hart Benton was a famous painter in the mid-20th century from Missouri. Have any of you ever heard of him? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. He actually came back here in 1947. His great Samuel Benton, the paragon of democracy that I was talking about earlier. Another part of the exhibit has a quote from the song Nutbush City Limits by Tina Turner, Tina Turner. And that Nutbush, she was born in Nutbush, Tennessee. And the Nutbush that she refers to, that area was settled by people from where? Granville County. And then y'all heard of Nutbush Creek and Nutbush Park on Carl Lake. That is the same Nutbush. And incidentally, Tina Turner's real name, Tina Turner's her stage name. Her real name is Alamay Bullock. Have y'all ever heard the name Bullock? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. And of course, our ancestors were enslaved people that were from Granville County. Going back to Williamsboro, I did want to mention the fact that it had the first law school in North Carolina. Was run by Leonard Henderson. We want to talk briefly about the Henderson family. Leonard Henderson was Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. The town of Henderson is named for him, which was in Granville County until 1881. His father was Richard Henderson. And I know you can't guess who Richard Henderson's great political rival was. They spent many hours trying to undo each other, and that was Thomas Person. One time, Richard Henderson in the state legislature of the Colonial Assembly at the time had accused Thomas Person of corruption, of treason, misuse of public funds. They had a trial in the legislature. They called 29 witnesses. The trial lasted for 3 weeks. And guess what happened? Thomas Person was acquitted. And the state legislature of the Colonial Assembly at the time was so irritated that they had to spend all this time and money that they charged Richard Henderson the fee for bringing all of those witnesses to what was then the capital of Newburgh. Let me talk about the Henderson family. Have any of you familiar with what's called the Transylvania Company? Literally, it's a Latin translation, means the land beyond the trees. This was the largest real estate venture in North Carolina, or actually in world history up until that time, certainly in North America. Richard Henderson, the Bullock family, the Hart family, some of the other wealthy people around here, purchased about 20 million acres of land in what became the state of Tennessee and Kentucky. And they went in the real estate business. Now, this was about 1763. Eventually, the British government declared this illegal. They confiscated most of the land, and then they went in the real estate business until they were defeated by the Americans in the Revolution. And then the United States government did what? They went into real estate. Incidentally, I will say, I don't want to get off topic too much though, but Lord Granville lost his lands after the Revolution. The state of North Carolina confiscated his unsold lands, and they went into the real estate business and opened up a state land office that did not close until 1963. And I guarantee you, go down to the courthouse, you'll find little edges and squares and little half-acre sections that are still owned by the state of North Carolina that are from Lord Granville's estate. Going back to the Transylvania Company, the idea, the Henderson family and the Bullock family and the Harts had the idea that they would hire a man on the spot to go out there and be their agent and to be the person who developed Transylvania, and they hired a man named Daniel Boone. And it's interesting because if my technology had not failed me, I could show you from a ledger from Williamsboro in 1781. There was a man named Robert Burton who had a distillery, and he also sold horses on the side. And if you look at it, there's a receipt, one bay mare sold to one Mr. Daniel Boone. And so Daniel Boone came through this area, and incidentally, you haven't achieved true fame in our world until you've been on television. And Richard Henderson was actually a recurring character on the old Daniel Boone show. Little Fest Parker, Daniel Boone, relax and split the tree and all the rest of that. Again, I point this out because Campbell County made a difference beyond this area. Now, along comes the revolution, and incidentally, I will say Williamsboro was actually famous because it was considered to be the capital. It was considered and lost by one voting committee for being considered the capital of North Carolina. Eventually, Raleigh got that prize. It was also considered for the location of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. One of the problems with Williamsboro is it was just not located centrally enough in the state. Also during the American Revolution, Governor Thomas Burke lived, he refugeed in Williamsboro in 1781, and so it was the de facto capital of North Carolina for a short time during the American Revolution. And I will say this area was very, very much part of the Patriot cause. People here were great believers in the idea of the revolution. They had already seen how a corrupt government had worked, and they had no taste for that, and they were looking for something a little more democratic, or at least what the idea of democracy was in the 1780s, which means some people. There was no Civil War battle, Revolutionary War battles. There was only one incident that I know of any military activity, and it was in 1781, and this was a petition from Benjamin Kimball and Larry White. At the request of their captain, they were sent out to search for some Tories or British soldiers that had been stealing horses and plundering the local communities. In the process of trying to find these people, their own horses were stolen. So this is a petition for the state of North Carolina. Incidentally, about 600 people from Granville County served in the American Revolution, and approximately, years I can tell, about 20 gave their lives in service to the country. This brings us up to the Revolution. Again, I apologize for not having my visuals today, but this is the first of a four-part series from the beginning to the end of the American Revolution and the establishment of Granville County. On our next program, next week, this time, we'll talk about the time period from the end of the Revolution to the end of that late unpleasantness known as the American Civil War. And so at this juncture, I kind of had to wing this when y'all have questions or anything. I'll be glad to see if I can answer. George, yeah.
Me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I was asking about John Carteret. In New Jersey, there's a city called Carteret. Is that named for him?
Probably because Carteret County is named for him too. They were lords proprietors. You'll see so many English names and names associated with Britain throughout eastern United States. I mean, it's just amazing. Some of the other lord proprietors, Hyde, Edgecombe, Hanover, Craven, you recognize.
Dinwiddie.
And incidentally, let me say, when I was remiss, I didn't mention John Penn.
That's who I was asking.
And who was one of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and was a native of Granville County. And basically, John Penn was elected to the state colonial assembly, and from there elected to be one of North Carolina's 3 representatives in the Continental Congress. He was present to sign the Declaration of Independence, and I find it ironic beyond measure that a man with the name Penn became famous for signing something. But he was in office for no other reason than he was FOT, a friend of Thomas Person's. Person was the one that got him to run. and I'm not gonna say he controlled him, but he set John Penn in a direction and influenced him greatly. Because one of the rivals, yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Mark, I'm glad you mentioned John Penn. You have stated here that John Penn signed the Declaration of Independence in August.
Yes,
August 21. Explain the difference between.
okay, just
July
a couple of
4th
things
And
here.
August 21.
When was the Declaration of Independence signed? It's not July the 4th. The only person that signed it on July 4th was John Hancock. And if you notice, he wanted to be first and biggest at everything. According to John, according
And
to
his signature was.
so he said that he signed it extra large because he knew that George III had vision problems, and so he wanted to make sure that he signed it and that George III saw it. Certainly the only time in history that George III was ever labeled being farsighted. But most of the signers did not sign until August the 21st. It was officially adopted on July the 4th, but a lot of people don't realize that the actual signings, actually, the delegates came in and signed when it was convenient, and they were able to. I think John McKean, I think was his name. No, Robert McKean from New York did not sign until February of 1777. And interestingly, as a corollary to that, there were about 3 people that voted for the Declaration of Independence that never signed it because they either died or did not get reelected. Anyway, I had a question.
It was on John Penn, but I have another question. Why did they move his remains to Greensboro or wherever?
When I do my John Penn character, I get asked this question a lot. Somebody will say, move your body to Greensboro, and I have to stay in character, so I don't know anything about that. In 1893, well, I mean, that's like, it was kind of sad actually. If you notice, the term we use here in Granville County is his burial site is in Granville County, but he's not actually. He was buried there, but his actual grave. He was reinterred in 1893 at Guilford Courthouse. They had opened up the battlefield that year, and it was thought that they would take it would be kind of Revolution Central in North Carolina. They took there was several other famous people associated with the Revolution. Jethro Sumner out of Warren County. The remains, I think it was the remains of Cornelius Barnett were moved there, and it was thought that this would be a place where people could come and that there would be a focus for the revolution.
Do you think it was sort of like the Angeles where
Yeah.
they just moved some dirt and he's probably still
I don't know what it is about this area. I can name you several famous people that were removed. I mean, Annie Lee was removed from Warren County and taken back and buried with the Lees about 20 years ago. John Penn was reinterred in Guilford Courthouse. Jethro Sumner, a very famous Revolutionary War general, buried over in Warren County. His remains were removed there too. But the kind of thing that wouldn't happen today. And incidentally, his home existed until 1912. It burned in 1912, and there's about 40 enslaved people buried in the cemetery out there, which is unusually enough is right next to the Penn family cemetery. A lot of times you would find a lot of distance of separation between the white slave, the white graves, and the African American enslaved graves. And incidentally, the largest private cemetery in Granville County is located at Abrams Plains Plantation. There are over 500 African Americans, either enslaved or their descendants, that are buried in that cemetery.
Where's that?
Abrams Plains Plantation in northern Granville County, the old Davis Plantation. Named Abrams Plains because supposedly the men who built the house about fought in the Battle of Abrams Plains, which was not a Revolutionary War battle, but a battle in the French Union. Any other questions?
I got one more. I've been down to John Penn's grave. Why has there never been anything to commemorate that? It's a paved road and then it's dirt, it's holes, it's nothing there.
Well, for one thing, I will say the DAR has very judiciously and has with great care maintained his actual gravesite over the years. It's been subject to some vandalism. As you know, it's way off the beaten path.
Yeah.
Now, a first for Granville County, his historical marker located in Stovall, the big metal historical markers that you see everywhere all over North Carolina.
Mhm.
If you'll notice, the number on that one is 1. That was the first one ever put up in North Carolina. It was under John Penn in 1936. And incidentally, Stovall has one other first too. It was the location of the first Boy Scout troop in North Carolina.
Did that road that's there now to his grave, was that a newer road? Did it used to come in from a different way?
It would, no, what it would do, Nathan, it would go up, take a left, and then come across that creek and come out on Wilson Town Road over in,
Okay, so you could have come through from 15 over.
Yeah. It's interesting, I will say this, the amount of land that used to be under cultivation in Granville County is amazing. We probably have more land under forest cover right now than at any point probably in the last 200 years. I looked at some of the aerial maps that were taken in the 1930s and 40s by the Corps of Engineers when they were getting ready to build Carlisle. We have those at the library, you can see that. Almost all the land was developed. On the 1930 census on that road, on Michaels Creek Road, there were 13 different families living on that road. If you go there today, nobody knows. And of course, one of the reasons why is because nobody grows tobacco anymore. Well, they don't grow it out there. But you have to remember, tobacco was ubiquitous at one time. So, anyway, if y'all any more questions?
I got another.
Okay.
Also, on that road,
Yes.
Dr. Bracker had a place down there in a house, because my uncle, Jesse Williamson, lived there and farmed that.
Well, there was a Norwood house on that road too that they raided back.
No, but I know that one house.
Do what?
The same one.
Is that the same one? Okay. And incidentally, there are several houses I wanted to show you that predate the American Revolution. There's at least 3 houses that I know that are in this area that predate the American Revolution that are still standing. And if you'd like to learn more about a local history, I encourage you to visit the North Carolina room at the Reed Chase North Library or check out the exhibits here at the Granville County Museum.
You can show you all the visuals at the start of the next presentation.
Well, I know that Trey's gonna help me out here, and we can get it online. I gave myself half an hour, y'all. Half an hour, I'm telling you. See, this is why I tell all these young folks, you need to save your books and save your paper. Nobody listens to me.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I have a feeling that you really enjoyed this. I was looking from the back, but, I could actually just see, from the side, that you really enjoyed this. Well, guess what? He'll be right back doing the next segment, I believe, on the 13th, which is.
That's Tuesday.
Yes, so you can be right here.
At what time?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, and
But
go ahead.
I would suggest you come a little bit earlier, if you know what I mean. But, Mark, we just thank you for being here for that. But in the meantime, on Sunday afternoon, we will be having the grand opening of the exhibit here at 2 o'clock. It's the magic number 2. We'll kind of come in, mingle, look around, and so forth. And then about 2:30, we will have guest speaker Annette Meyer, and she's right back here with us now. And she's going to share about her life and experiences and whatever else. And you know Annette, like I do, it's the whatever else. And then she will be followed by the Yates sisters of Button. And you might remember them as growing up as the Yates family and singing on the Heart Curl radio show. So they will be following that, and so Sunday afternoon should be a good day. Good afternoon too, and this wonderful exhibit here. take some time to look through it now, but it's going to be up through January 19th. January 19th. And there's also, as you go out, some free materials to pick up. We do have some cider here. If you'd like some of that, we'll just mingle, enjoy, and talk to them.
Oh, and by the way, it's working.
We did a good job there.
We also like to take a look, the last thing I want to point out, this is my CFI hole. This is about 2,500 years old. This is about 2,500 years old, and I found this in 17 different pieces. I found it in the mud, in the water. The water had frozen.